Okay, so I'll talk to you about emotion regulation. Okay, and the thing is that we all have negative emotions, and the negative emotions like fear, disgust, guilt, shame. All of these emotions are adaptive, right? We need them in order to adapt to our environment, to lead a successful life, to be good members of our society. We don't want not to feel negative emotions. But sometimes these emotions can get out of hand, right? And this is when this happens, this has a negative effect on our well-being. So one way you can one strategy you can attempt in order to boost people's well-being is to try to make them feel more positive emotions, right? And another possibility is to try to reduce the amount of overwhelming negative emotions that they feel in their daily lives. I think this latter strategy is better because society has already given us a whole host of ways to increase our positive emotions, like drugs, like music, and when something is super effective, we get addicted to it. So what psychology usually focuses on, and also the neuroscience of emotion regulation, is how to decrease and control your negative emotions. Okay? And you know, often you can use other people in order to help you regulate your negative emotions. You can go to a clinician, to a psychologist or psychiatrist. You can talk to your friends, and they can offer you ways in order to deal with your ways to deal with your negative emotions and be happier. But sometimes you're alone, right? Even after you go to your shrink and you come back, and then you're left with the emptiness of your existence. And what can you do when you don't have people around, when you don't have careful supervision around? How can you still continue to maintain your emotions in stressful situations? So the question is, how can we self-regulate our emotions? We need our emotions to move around in the world, but how can we have some control over them in a way that in the proper way? So one possibility that has been discussed a lot in the literature in psychology is to try to control what we think about in order to control our emotions. Okay, so let's do a short experiment. Please do not imagine the face of Chuck Norris, okay? Are you not imagining the face of Chuck Norris? You're not imagining Chuck Norris. Nobody is imagining Chuck Norris. Okay. Did anyone succeed in not imagining the face of Chuck Norris? No? You succeeded. No Chuck Norris? You don't know who it is. Very bad with faces. Okay. So it didn't work, right? This is Chuck Norris, if you remember. So it's tough, right? Uh, we can control what we think about. We can get better at that, but it's tough. And it's tough. This Norris, yeah, tough. Chuck Norris is also tough. Chuck Norris can control his emotions easily. So it's tough, but it's doable. And a lot of research in psychology, in the psychology of emotion regulation, has tried to figure out how people can better regulate their emotions, and also to understand what makes people good at regulating their emotions and how it relates to their well-being, to psychiatric issues, and etc. And a lot of this research has been along the lines of this model. This is called the process model of emotion regulation. I'm not a fan of it, but I will describe it anyway because it's central to the field of emotion regulation. And the idea comes from models in cognitive psychology, in the psychology of thinking about how we process information, right? How we think. And yeah, and this in this world there is, or there was at least, this belief that the information processing stream in our brain is relatively serial. There is a sort of a pipeline of processing of information in the world. So if we see a scary dog, then there is a process that we can define of what happens when we see the dog, how we process it, how we respond to it. Okay? Oh, not close enough. Interesting. Okay, so uh, the idea there is that there are processes such as situation selection. First off, where do we put ourselves? Do we put ourselves in a situation where we will have a scary dog around? The situation modification, can we run from the dog, or can we, what do we do once we are in the situation? And when we are in the situation, there are all sorts of attentional processes. Okay, all the world of attentional processing. We can focus on the scary dog. We can look away. Okay. And then once we look at the dog, we can have all sorts of appraisals of the dog. We can think of the dog in different ways. We can think of the dog as being our friend, as being intimidating. And then we have our response, which can be something that is sort of instinctual or something that is willful. And we can try to modulate this response. We can try just not to respond whenever we're scared. Okay? This makes perfect sense, right? And when you look at this cascade of events, you can ask yourself, where can I intervene in the emotion elicitation regulation process, right? Where can I try to put the brakes on negative emotions? If I'm super afraid of dogs, what can I do? So obviously, I can try to stay away from dogs. That won't be very adaptive because dogs are all around, especially in Tel Aviv, unfortunately for me. But we can still control cognitive processes that go on once we are faced with these scary dogs, right? So a lot of the focus has been on these processes of cognitive control that I try to insinuate with when I try to make you not to think about Chuck Norris and his face. Don't think about the face of Chuck Norris now as well, okay? So you have these processes where you control your attention, right? If you have issues with these processes, you might have attention deficit disorder, and etc. And you have all sorts of processes when you see an object and try to understand the meaning of this object, the interpretation of this object, right? These are all cognitive processes, and they're supposedly things that we can intervene with. And first off, there's the question of what happens, where do these processes come from? And the answer is that there's a lot of research on the cognitive control of emotion and cognitive control in general. And we know pretty well that there are systems in the brain, frontal systems, mostly frontal parietal systems, that are responsible for these processes of cognitive control. And if you disrupt these areas, then you would have detriments in cognitive control. And these same cognitive control processes are also involved when you try not to think of Chuck Norris, not to think about troubling thoughts, when you try to inhibit strong responses you have to things that scare you. Whenever you try to control your emotions, you rely on these frontal regions, frontal parietal regions. Okay, and supposedly one might try, maybe you, to find ways to train these processes, these areas, through various methods, cognitive training, the type of things you see quite a lot, right? You might even try to find ways to intervene biologically, maybe with things like deep TMS or whatever, things that might boost this system and try to, increase it like a muscle. Okay, like you go to a gym to boost your muscles, you might be able to do this. And there's a lot of attempts to do that. Obviously, the entire world of cognitive training, but also whenever people try to regulate their emotions using these cognitive methods in CBT, okay, you can even say that all sorts of meditation practices actually do that, right? And there's a lot of research about how meditation sort of intervenes with this cognitive control network. So there's a lot of things you can do there if you're interested, but you should also be aware of the limitations of the cognitive control methods for emotion regulation, okay? And you can get a sense of these limitations by thinking about what happens to the lateral prefrontal cortex, the regions that are involved in cognitive control, what goes wrong in these regions and when. So first off, young children still haven't matured in these areas of the brain that are responsible for cognitive control. So it might be the case that it is at least claimed that cognitive control interventions, training might be less relevant in these cases. Okay. Also, in old age, as we grow older, our brain starts to dismantle itself earlier than you think, and you gain some capacities, but you lose a lot of the cognitive control capacities. 5 minutes. Okay. In ADHD, of course, all of the attention deficit spectrum disorders, then there you also have supposedly biological impairments in the ability for cognitive control, for attentional control, for inhibition. When you're tired, okay, when you're tired, you just aren't as able to control your cognition just as much as you're unable to control your body as you want to. Okay, fatigue makes the lateral prefrontal cortex go away. And depression and anxiety and all sorts of psychiatric conditions are also associated with decreased cognitive control capacities, okay, and decreased activity in these areas. And it's a question, what is the cause and what is the effect, right? Maybe because we don't have cognitive control resources, then we are unable to control negative thoughts, and then we become depressed, or there's also evidence for the other way around, okay? So this is the standard paradigm in the field, and these are the limitations. I'm going to talk to you for just a minute about what we're doing in my lab in order to try to address the problem of self-regulation. And what we're trying to look at is to see how you can regulate your emotion with a different cognitive system that is not the cognitive control system of the brain, but is called the mentalizing system. So mentalizing is the capacity to step inside the mind of others in order to understand their thoughts and feelings. So if I'm a very anxious person, afraid of dogs, I can try to think perhaps what would happen in the mind of Chuck Norris, right? And the interesting thing about this is that actually we evolved to mentalize. This is the thing we're good at. We're social creatures. Our evolution occurred alongside the ability to better understand the minds of other conspecifics, and this is our advantage. Cognitive control, we're not better than chimps. Chimps are actually better than us in cognitive control, in working memory, in inhibition, and all of these tasks. Where we beat the system is in our capacity to understand the mind of others, in mental state inference. And there's a specific brain region, brain network, that is responsible for mentalizing, focused on the medial prefrontal cortex. It's distinct from the cognitive control network. So this is what we'll see if we'll ask what does Chuck Norris think, then we'll activate the blue regions, the mentalizing network. And if we try to tell people do not think of Chuck Norris, then we'll activate the red areas, the cognitive control network. So our approach, and you can just to give you an example of an alternative approach to the cognitive control paradigm, this is our approach. Try to see whether we can actually rely on the capacity to think about the minds of others, to be empathetic, to be a mind reader, and utilize this capacity in order to regulate our emotions. This is an example of an alternative method. So if you're an anxious person and you see this scary poodle, you can think, what would Chuck Norris think? What would Chuck Norris think? Chuck Norris think this is just a poodle. This is nothing to be afraid of. And then I become Chuck Norris myself, okay? Now, this is a little bit like acting, right? So this is a sort of emotion regulation strategy that is a bit like fake it till you make it. And what we're looking at in my lab is whether it's real or not. So this is the central question, right? Whenever we do all sorts of emotion regulation approaches, whenever we try emotion regulation approaches, the question is whether they're just something that works on the surface but doesn't change something within. So we rely on all sorts of objective measures such as neuroimaging, eye tracking, skin conductance response, and also language analysis in order to understand more objectively whether this sort of pretend play, whether this sort of make-believe of trying to think that I'm Chuck Norris, whether it actually makes you a little bit like Chuck Norris. And we have a project that sort of starts to get at more and more evidence that this is indeed the case, that you indeed change something deep when you try to pretend. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.